All right. So welcome everybody that's in the fan club currently and all new fan club signups. My name is Liz Daly. I am one of the instructors and also in charge of all classes and scheduling classes at String Theory Yarn Company. So today we're talking about gauge, and I am going to launch a poll, and there is no judgment on this poll whatsoever. I just kind of am looking for where everybody is or where the majority of people are when it comes to gauge and knitting a gauge swatch um, and what I should talk about and what I should kind of gloss over. Um, I'll give everybody a few minutes with that. And while we are doing that, Um, I try to run a really laid back class. If you have any questions with anything that I'm going over, you can feel free to ask. You could put it in chat. But in fact, um, if you would, if you have any questions on Gauge that you would like answered, please feel free to put it in the chat, and I can come around to that. So, all right. So I'm going to end the poll. Um, Share the results. So it looks like um starting out, um everybody knows what gauge is. Great. And most of the people have knit a gauge swatch before. And do you understand how to read a gauge swatch? And there we're kind of split. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I am going to get rid of that. And then I am going to okay. So I am going to go over the I'm a very visual person. And so I came up with um what has really helped me really understand gauge and how to read a gauge swatch and what to do and how to really understand it. So I'm gonna go over that, do a little bit of math, not a lot, but just a little bit. Um, and because the little bit of math that we're going to do is really eye-opening, I found to really understand how being off in your gauge swatch um, just a little bit can really affect your project. So oh, Sarah, I am right with you. I typically only knit a gauge swatch myself for a sweater, very rarely for hats or shawls or cowls or scarves. In fact, I was talking to you about my Newish Knitter Knitalong group that all the projects are gauge optional, meaning that if you are off a little bit on a gauge on a project, for example, a cowl, a scarf, if your project is like an inch or two, like bigger, smaller, for a gauge for a cowl or a scarf, it's really not going to affect that much as long as you have plenty of yarn. Um, maybe two different techniques. Okay. Okay, so let's switch here. Let me flip my video around. Okay. All right. Okay. So for ease of learning, um, and for ease of stitches, um, we're just going to work with this square for a bit. Okay. This is just a 10 by 10 square, and each square is going to represent a stitch. Okay. And we're going to pretend that this is a 4 by 4 square because most gauge swatches, most patterns call out gauge. Um, Here's one sweater, uh, 24 stitches in 4 inch, stitches and rounds in 4 inch. So they're talking about a 4 inch square, or even knit flat. So in the round and flat. Um, and then, oh, yep. Oh, here's the gauge right here. Um, 4 inches in stockinette stitch after blocking. So 4 inches is a big thing. Um, Overseas they use a metric system, and 10 centimeters is close to 4 inches. So I think that's where it all comes from. So for ease of math and numbers, let's say our gauge for this example is we need 10 by 10 stitches by 10 rows. So we knit something up. And through going through my notes. Um, okay, so we've all knit the gauge swatch, and it's always, and I'm sure it's you knit a gauge swatch and it's close. Instead of 10 stitches, maybe we get 9. And you might think, is being off 1 stitch really going to matter? Is it really, really going to matter? So here is my 9 in my square, my 4 by 4 square. That is, it is, wait, I said that wrong. So 9. So say you get 9. So here is this one. I did that in reverse and I always flip myself. So here is, if I remove this last row, and you can see that instead of having my 10 inches end at 4, my 10 stitches ending at 4 inches, my 10 stitches ends past it. So in this example, this would be if when I was measuring my gauge, instead of getting 10 stitches per 4 inches, I would have 9 stitches per 4 inches. And in order to get that 10 stitches, I would have to go past my 4 inches. So if your gauge is bigger, and I typically don't measure 4 inches across when I'm measuring gauge. I will measure 2 inches here, and I will measure 2 inches maybe up here. So when I have my gauge swatch, and oftentimes I will knit something larger than 4 inches. For example, so backing up a little bit, if your gauge says 15 stitches in 4 inches, I will typically cast on, for this example, maybe 20 stitches. I always want to do extra. Sometimes I will put a garter band around the gauge swatch, and sometimes I'll just knit it regular. Um, for this one, I have 24 stitches, so I would easily do 30. Those end stitches, they're kind of distorted. So if I'm going to do anything, I want to have a buffer on either side. So to answer and to kind of discuss, there's a big yellow bag with gauge swatches in it. Big yellow fluffy bag-ish, like a zipper bag. No, like this big. Um, I'm trying to have my daughter assistant get me my bag of gauge swatches missing. Um, so that's what I do, and I'll take the 2-inch measurements, somewhere here and somewhere up here, and I will compare those, take the average. So this will make, just in general, this will make my, let's say, sweater, scarf, shawl, whatever, larger, because in order to get those 10 stitches, I have to get outside of my 4-inch block. Now, say the opposite is true. say when I get my 10 inches, my 10 stitches, my 10 stitches, it's going to be less than 4 inches. So it means that I need to get 11 stitches in that 4 inch square. So if my 10 stitches is smaller, obviously it's going to be a smaller project, smaller sweater, smaller shawl, whatever. If your gauge is tighter, it's a bag like this, but yellow-ish. No, it looks like that though. Sorry. Okay. So when you're knitting your gauge swatch, what I would do is I would take a measurement in two locations for 2 inches, 2 inches increment here, 2 inch increment there, divide it by two and get your stitches per inch. Now, you might be thinking, is it going to really matter all that much? And it does. So here is one of the sweaters I am working on. So I'm working on the Ramona pullover, and my goal gauge is 15 stitches per 4 inches. And that equals to 3.75 stitches per 1 inch. And I always write down the needle I'm using, and I always write down both unblocked and blocked gauge. Because anytime you block something, wet block, steam block, what have you, is going to change the yarn. Whether the yarn blooms, if it's a sport weight, it tends to grow. A whole bunch of different things could happen. So my first go was to use a size 4. And so my goal was 3.75 stitches per inch. And I ended up having 3.5 stitches per inch. And you're thinking, big deal, right? We're talking a quarter of a stitch per inch. So when I do the math, so how you figure out um, how many stitches, at least how I figure it out, is if the pattern has a good schematic, meaning if in the pattern it has a spot where inside the pattern there's a drawing of the sweater with all the measurements, then you should be able to get a bunch of information there. If it doesn't, so like some sweaters might have a chart, so you can check your numbers there. But if your pattern, and oftentimes patterns don't have schematics, what I do is I look at the number for where you separate, if it's a top-down sweater, for example, top-down, where you break off the sleeves from the rest of the body. And it will always tell you how many stitches that are on your body to start out to, start knitting in the round. That's the number I'm looking at. So in this pattern, after I split for the sleeves, I should have 172 stitches for the body. And keep in mind, I'm just a quarter of a stitch off. So I divide it by 3.75, and I'm getting 46 inches. If I do what I got in my gauge swatch, 3.5, I'm getting 49 inches. So I'm off just by having a quarter of a stitch off. I'm now off 3 stitches. And this now is closer to the next size up than the size that I wanted. Um, and I have found that the looser the gauge, the less stitches per inch, the bigger of a difference you're going to see. So if I come back and I do this for all the sweaters, and that's my unblocked gauge. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to block this sweater, this gauge swatch, which I had, it's still drying. And I'm going to take these measurements again, and see how they change. The reason why I take measurements before and after blocking is as you are knitting, you're not knitting on blocked yarn, you're knitting on unblocked yarn. So you need to find out if when you're knitting, if this is going to stretch out, if it's going to grow. Then maybe instead of, if the pattern says, for example, if it's a sweater, once you're knitting the body of it, if the body's supposed to be 11 inches, you know your yarn is going to grow. Maybe you stop at 9 inches instead of doing all of the 11. So I always take this information before and after blocking. Um, here's here's another one. So my gauge needed to be 8 stitches per 2 inches, or well, my gauge was 8 stitches per 2 inches or 4 stitches per inch. And my goal was 3.5 inches. And on this one, I'm like, all right, I want to do a size 3 with 51-inch finished bust. So here is my goal. So that matches up 51 inches, give or take. In this pattern, it was kind of hard to find exactly where the bust line was for the measurement. But if I take that 180 stitches divided by 4, I get 45 inches, which is a difference of 6 inches. Again, just by being a half of a stitch off. So again, if I change to a different size, that gets me to the number I want a little bit more. But this is where being off just a little bit can make a huge difference. And so, here it's a half of a stitch. And here on the other example, it was a quarter of a stitch. Now, when I measure things, um, I measure to the fullest. I measure to the half a stitch when I'm actually measuring. So here's my bag of, I'm trying to find the one that I typically try to find one that's easy to show up on screen. Okay. So, do you just choose a different size to make a pattern? Yes. So if I'm knitting a sweater, I will do my best to get the gauge that the sweater calls for, um, by changing my needles. So I know if my gauge is too loose, I know by looking at this, if this is, if I have fewer stitches, so I should have 10 stitches at my 4 spot, I have less than 4. So if you have a number that is less than your gauge, you want to go down a needle size. So whatever needle size gave me this, I want to go down 1, maybe 2 needle sizes. If I have a gauge where it is a lot more stitches, or even just a little bit, if you have more stitches than the pattern calls for, you want to go up. You want to get to a larger needle size. Now, and so in a perfect situation, you will change needles maybe once or twice and get your gauge. But if you don't, um, if you don't get your gauge, or if you like the fabric that you're getting, then that is where the math, that just the simple math of figuring out, going through your pattern and figuring out where they have the um here. So on this pattern, so this is what I'm talking about. So it might say underarm divide, something about sleeve split, something like that. So you want to go find the total stitches, and you want to figure out what that total stitches are, what those total stitches are. And we're talking for a sweater here. So for a total sweater, your sweater, and that could be, if you're knitting from the bottom up, if there's no shaping, you want to figure out what those stitches are. Um, and that's going to be your bust measurement. And every sweater is different. Most sweaters talk about a bust measurement, which realistically is the measurement around your body underneath your armpit. For most sweaters, if there's no shaping. If there is shaping, then there should be more information in the pattern. But say this is the fabric that I love. I didn't get gauge, but this is the fabric that I love. Then I need to look at what gauge this is in comparison to my gauge swatch. So say that this is my goal, and in my gauge swatch, this is what I like. So this means in order to get this space, I am going to have to knit more, meaning I am going to need more yarn, which is another key component of gauge. If you need to pack in more stitches into your square, into your 4-inch square that the pattern calls for, then you are going to be using more yarn. So that's why and this is not at all a sales pitch, but oftentimes when I am buying yarn for a sweater, I will either add one extra skein, or say if I am knitting a size 4, I will buy yarn for a size 5. We have a very generous return policy at the store. So I know I can always return that extra skein or two. But just in case I get something that I like, that the gauge is a little bit different than what I'm shooting for, I have that option. Another thing I would do is I would read through the pattern. If there's no schematic, which oftentimes there's not, I would read through the pattern. Is a sweater boxy? How about the arms? What do I have to do differently with the arms to modify this? Because once you have your gauge, you can just look at, for example, the arms. How many stitches do you pick up on the arms? And do the same thing that you did here. Maybe this is your arm measurement. However many stitches you pick up for your arms, divide that by your gauge and measure your arm. Is that going to fit if you're choosing a different size? Most of the time, so these pattern designers go off of a generic proportional body type, which sometimes we fit into and sometimes we don't. So if we don't, we need to just kind of look at the pattern, the whole pattern, and see if that fits our body type. Yes, is in a pattern gauge. I always assume it to be when it lists the pattern gauge, I always assume that to be blocked. Um, I always assume that to be blocked. I assume that to be your final measurement. And sometimes they'll say it and sometimes they won't, but I always assume it to be the final. And I always check my gauge throughout. Not necessarily often, but as soon as I am able to try the sweater on or even compare the sweater to something I own, I will do that right away. Just to make sure I'm on. Um, and after I'm knitting for a while, I will check the gauge on my sweater just to make sure because when you're knitting something this small, um, and then when you're knitting a large sweater or shawl or whatever it is that you're knitting, gauge wise, you want to check and always double check to make sure that you're still on. Does that all make sense?
Because when you're blocking it, are you actually literally washing it or are you just steam blocking it?
I always wet block mine.
Mm.
I've heard of a lot of people steam blocking. I have never tried steam blocking yet. Um, and I don't know a lot about it, but I know the people that I've heard talk about it, they really love it. I've always wet blocked it. So I will soak this. Um, I will soak this in water for 20 or so minutes. Um, take it out and I just lay it flat to dry. And then once it's dry, I check my gauge again just to see if anything has changed. I'm um oftentimes for me, super items that are super wash grow. And so if it does grow on here for a super wash, I will wet this again, not soaking wet, but just kind of dampen it. Um, and then put it in a dryer on a low setting for like maybe 5 minutes on in a lingerie bag, and then check it again. So if I'm knitting with superwash, I'll have it unblocked, a blocked, and if those two are really off, then I will have a third measurement that is like, after I dry it. Reading the label, making sure that it is dryer proof, but sometimes superwash yarn really stretches out, and so you have to do something to bring it back in. And yes, I do check my gauge as I go because whether or not
Yeah.
you're getting um, a sweater, and this is where it comes in handy to have that measurement of before you block it and then after you block it. Because when I am knitting a gauge swatch like this, a 4x4, well, this isn't a 4x4. I kind of sometimes get very impatient and I don't want to go through the whole 4 inches. You should. There's a lot of conversation out there and sweaters that maybe a better gauge swatch for a sweater is like a 6 inch by 6 inch or even 12 inch by 12 inch. Because when you think about the size of the sweater versus this little gauge swatch, like this really isn't going to tell you very much. Because when you are knitting anything substantial, you have to then take into account the weight of the yarn itself and how that's going to distort your gauge. So as I'm knitting, I will check my gauge. I will look and I will do it different ways. I will be very technical about it and I'll get out my ruler and oh, this one doesn't, I have it marked on here. I will count my stitches and I will be very technical about it. Or I will even just take whatever I am knitting and I will put it up against something in my wardrobe that I want to match the size with, another sweater or something, and I will put it on there to see if it's a lot bigger or a lot smaller. Now, if I am, and I say this because I have a fingering weight sweater, that had some color work in it, and it doesn't fit. I I knit it all, and one of these days I just have to pour myself a glass of wine and just rip it out and either do it over or do use something else with the yarn. So I learned my lesson that I check the gauge, I check the size throughout. Um, because when I am knitting a gauge swatch, I might be excited. I might be excited that I'm starting a new project. I might be frustrated because I am knitting using the needles that I'm using for the sweater. So I could be trying to knit this gauge swatch using 40-inch needles. And they're banging around, they're cumbersome, versus when I really get into the pattern, I could be more relaxed. Or maybe my stitches loosen. So again, if I have that number before blocking number, and I check my gauge swatch and I check my sweater, I'm sorry, if I check my sweater or whatever it is I'm knitting, um, if I check the after and maybe what I'm knitting is maybe a stitch off. And I just saw with the math that I showed that if I'm off by just one stitch, that could be a couple inches. So that's why for a sweater, I want it to fit. And I would rather, because I have to take out that one sweater that doesn't fit, I would rather take out a sweater partially and redo it, switch the needles, do whatever, than have another sweater that doesn't fit. And the same is true for so I always knit a gauge swatch for sweaters because I want it to fit. The same thing is true for shawls. Like if I am knitting um a, a pie shawl, so a shawl that you start here and you keep on getting bigger and bigger. And so, it's this half moon shape, this half moon shape. And a lot of times, well, some of the patterns I have has like a lacy design on the end. I don't want to run out of yarn. I don't want to have too much yarn and I don't want to run out of yarn. So I will do a gauge swatch for this too to make sure that I have enough yarn because, I don't want to, get to here and need to buy another skein just for a little bit. Um, I just want to make sure that I have enough. Um, so it doesn't really matter if it needs, does it go? Yeah. So, and then with, with a sweater, you can be, maybe the sweater you are working on, has a really tight gauge. You can always change it to a looser gauge. If it's on a worsted weight and it's really tight and I want to knit it in a fingering weight, um, it'll just be a lot looser. Um, Another thing I would say about knitting a gauge swatch, oh, here it is. Um, and this affects things too, is knit your gauge swatch in the way that you are going to um, knit your pattern. Meaning, if the pattern is knit in the round, then I need to knit my gauge swatch in the round. If the pattern is knit flat with knits and purls, that's how I need to do my gauge swatch. And you say, why? Um, the purl stitch is typically looser and just the structure of it is a little bit wider than the knit stitch. The knit stitch, if you get really technical, is a little bit narrower, a little bit taller. Um, the purl stitch is a little bit wider, narrower, kind of short and stocky, you might think. So when I knit a gauge swatch, I look at the pattern. Is a pattern knit in the round or is a pattern knit flat? So this sample here, I knit the bottom flat, knit across on the right side, purl across on the wrong side. The top section of the sweater, I knit across, and then I pulled the needle to the other side and I brought the yarn over to the other side and I knit across and then pulled it and then knit across and then pulled it. So that is my way of kind of faking a gauge swatch in the round. And the difference between these two is a stitch and a half. So this knitting flat with knits and purls is a stitch and a half wider. Is a stitch and a half. How do I say this to make sense? So this top portion, the same number of stitches, but this is narrower and this is wider. So if given a 2-inch measurement, this top portion would have an inch, 1.5 more stitches than this bottom portion for the same 2-inch measurement. And that's just how I knit. Would you go over how? Yes. So, um, I can see if I have, I'm trying to see. I'm trying to grab something that I have on my needles. Um, where I can, okay. So let's pretend this is my gauge swatch. So let's see if I can get it to work here. So I'm going to knit across. I really need here. I don't have, let me, I'm just going to cast on a few stitches real quick. Oh, where are, yeah, the knitting, the faking in the round is really, really helpful. Um, because it will give you much more of an accurate measurement if you are knitting something in the round. And um, that's such a huge thing when you're knitting a gauge swatch, is you need to knit it using the needles you are using for the project, and also knitting knitting the pattern. Is it stockinette that you're doing? Is it a pattern? So I get to my end and my yarn is over here. So typically I would turn and knit back. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide all these stitches to the other end of my needle. I'm going to trying to get my tail out of the way. So I'm going to take my working yarn and go across. And this is where knitting extra stitches. So like on the one example, it was 15 stitches per 4 inches. When you do this, you really need to have more stitches because these end stitches are going to, like the last stitch and this first stitch especially, they're going to be distorted just because of the nature of what we're doing. So I'm knitting across or doing whatever pattern whatever knit pattern the pattern calls for. Oopsie. Pull it tight. So again, I'm at the end of my needle. I'm going to send the needle across. And then I bring this over, kind of hold it. And it really doesn't matter how tight or loose you're holding it. Um, how tight or loose, because you're going to cut it when you're all done. And no, it's not going to unravel. Um, so knitting across that way. And then, um, yeah, like I have this gauge swatch right here where when you're done, you just come through and cut those back threads so that it lays nice and flat. And you can count your stitches that way. And that's going to give you a truer gauge swatch than if you're knitting and purling. Because if there's no knits and if there's no purls in your pattern, there shouldn't be any purls in your gauge swatch. Like whatever's in your gauge swatch should be in the pattern. So does anyone have any questions on how to, I know there's a question on there. Just going through making sure I hit all of them. A permanent engaged swatch with two different size needles and reading near. Um, okay, so how I do it, and I will say that um, my eyes are also starting to go. So I have readers, I have bright lights, um, and however you see the stitches. So when you are knitting, you have the loop is on the top. I always think of it as the loop is on top of the needle. So the point should be down below. So if I take, this is my sample so I can mark it up. So like say this is my stitch right here. So it's like a V pointing down. So I will take that and line that up as much as I can across the way. And I will take it and I will count each point. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I have like right here, I have like 8.5 because where I have my 2 is going down the center of the stitch. So when I am counting my stitches, I do 2 inches and I go to either the end or the middle. I don't get real picky on, okay, this is a quarter or this is a third. For when I count my stitches, I go to the either full or to the half. So then I will move my stitch someplace, my gauge swatch someplace else. And here we can go up to the top portion. So that bottom was 8.5. So the top portion, so I'm going to line up my edge along that column and across the row. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. So see that knitting, and again, this was knit back and forth. This was knit faking in the round, and we have a full stitch difference, which as we saw in the example, that could cause a couple inches difference on your sweater, being either too big or too small, just by being one stitch off. So again, that's where you really need to create your gauge swatch, however you're going to knit the pattern, whether it be flat or in the round. Um, Now, did that make sense on how to count your stitches? So I don't do four all the way across. I'd rather have the middle stitches. It seems like the ends kind of get distorted, whether you do garter stitch on the end to keep it flat, um, or like, here my ends are curved. I haven't cut this one because this is my sample one. Um, but the ends are just like these ends are like, looser. So that's why I never go the whole way across. I do 2 inches. Um, and we didn't talk a lot about row gauge. Row gauge is the counting of the stitches up and down. Uh, for most of my patterns, I'm working with the stitches, the stitch count. Um, I would be, as long as I'm close with the row count, I consider myself good. Again, I was purchase a skein or two extra, just as my security for when I'm knitting a sweater, uh, so that I have some extra to play with. If I am working on a sweater that has a cable design or a lace design, where when I look at the pattern says repeat cable design 4 times for the body, that is when I really want to hit both my stitch and my row gauge, um, because it's a repeat of a pattern. But if my sweater talks about knitting the body until I get to a certain number of inches, then I don't worry about row gauge all that much because I'm just going to knit until I reach a certain point, knowing that as long as I'm close, knowing that I have extra yarn that I can pull from. Uh, Row gauge that, I'm gonna swatch apart and use as yardage. Um, okay, no, okay. So the question was, do patterns take into account enough yarn for a gauge swatch? I yes, no, maybe. Um, yes. So yes. So yes, no, and maybe. And here, um let me switch videos. Um, and I say yes, no, maybe. So in my whoops, oh, wrong one. Um, Video settings. Here we go. Um, okay. So in my position, I am fortunate enough to talk to a lot of other instructors, a lot of other designers, and this question has come up often in that if you're designing a pattern, hat, shawl, mitten, sweater, what have you, but especially, we're talking a lot about sweaters, because there's something that you want it to fit, plus it's a large yarn purchase. Um, the rule of thumb, according to celebrity official designers, is that they add in 10% of the yarn to account for people's knitting, what have you, different yarn choices. But 10% really isn't a ton. It really isn't that much extra. Some designers will add in 15 to 20%. And so that gets a little bit better. The thing that kind of drives me crazy is I wish the designers would put a line in there saying this is the yardage and it's based on 10%, 10% extra or 15% extra than was used. But I've yet to find a pattern or a yarn designer or, pattern designer that has added that to their pattern. So it should be, um, but then that's where that extra skein can come in handy. Um, what was it? Yeah, because I know that Marie Green always adds in like 15%. And she said that, and I know that because she said that. Other designers out there design for yarn companies. So their yardage is based on the number of skeins. So if, say, for example, uh, their yardage might be in 200 yard increments because the skeins of yarn are 200 yards. So it might be, a size 4 is 1600, size, 5 is 1800. It's based on the yarn, the yarn company that they're working for. And again, they don't necessarily tell you that or explicit in the directions. You have to be um, an investigator a little bit. If they talk about the yarn, if they talk about specific yarn, they might be designing for that yarn company, instead of designing a sweater and just happen to use that yarn. Do you see the difference? And sometimes, um, sometimes designers will use test knitters, and they will ask the test knitters, did you get gauge? And then how much yardage did you use? And they will adjust their yardage accordingly for the pattern. But then that test knitter, you keep the sweater. So the designer never sees that sweater. And so the designer can't really check the gauge. So they're just trusting that, oh, yeah, I got gauge. Oh, yeah, this fits great. So those are all the different things. So, like I said, it's not a sales pitch to buy more yarn, but that's why oftentimes if I pick my size and I go to the store and buy the yarn, I will buy the next size up. Or, depending on, if the next size up is two skeins, I'll just buy one skein. Um, just to kind of have the 10% extra that the designer should be adding, but then the buffer of having more, if that makes sense. And then there's always stripes. I've had sweaters where I've run out of yarn or the yarn is mismarked. And I'll just kind of add a stripe in, get kind of creative, which is frustrating, but it's something that you can do. Um, yeah, did that answer it? Yeah, that's, if I could change patterns, there's two things I would change. The bind off loosely. I would I would tell people you have to give us more direction. And then the second thing is when you are calling out yardages, how did you figure the yardage? And just have a line in there, you know, based on this, company X's skeins of yarn, um, based on test knitters, based on test knitters plus 20%, or, based on, the designer's math and, what the designer has. I wish they would add that line in there because I think that would be so helpful in trying to figure out yardage and what's enough, what's too much, and what's not enough. So I hope that was helpful. I'm just going through. Um, all right. So this month is 15% off curio, I think. Um, and it should be in the email that went out. Um, and again, welcome to all the new fan club members. Um, I don't know exactly what next month is going to be yet. I'm working on it. I think we're going to have uh, uh, someone come in um, and do the class for, we'll do the meetup for next month. Um, but yeah, hopefully this was helpful on Gauge Swatch and how and gauge and how to envision um, what exactly is going on and how to measure it, how to knit a gauge swatch, um, and yeah, and how to once you get that gauge swatch, I always check and double check that math, um, just to see how much of a difference. Um, because yeah, like that sweater that I'm working on right now, the Ramona pullover. When I did the math, and I measured my 2-inch sections, and I was off by a quarter of a stitch. Was that really going to matter? Um, and yeah, and it did, in a big way. So I'm picking a different size. Um, and you can always ask, feel free to ask, email the store, call up one of us, stop in. We're more than happy to help you. Um, with anything gauge related and to kind of help you along the process of making sure that you have enough.